The house still stands, though the street has forgotten its name. Inside, the air smells of flour, smoke, and something that never left. Philadelphia, 1868. The city wakes beneath a haze of coal smoke and the sour scent of the Schuylkill River. Streetcars grind past brick facades, their wheels shrieking against damp rails. Along Callowhill Street, where factory whistles punctuate the air like clockwork prayers, the Mohrman family keeps a modest grocery beneath the rooms where they live. The shopfront window is clouded by flour dust. Inside, the smell of yeast and pickled onions mixes with something faintly sweet molasses spilled long ago into the wood grain. By all accounts, the family was unremarkable. Johann Mohrman, the father, kept his ledgers in precise script, each entry squared, his inventory never short. His wife, Elise, was known for her quiet composure, a woman who moved through the narrow aisles of the store with the steadiness of habit. They had 3 children, 2 boys and the youngest, Mary, not yet 6, whose voice carried above the traffic and market noise like a bird in the rafters. The neighbors remembered her for her ribbons always mismatched, always bright against the soot of the city. She was seen often sitting on the stoop, arranging pebbles into patterns that no one else could decipher. She talked to herself as she played, but the words were not quite German, not quite English. Elise said it was the babble of dreams. Others thought it strange, though harmless. Then came the afternoon when the street grew quiet. The ironworks bell had just struck 3. A drizzle hung in the air, smearing soot into the gutters. Elise called down from the upstairs window for Mary to come in. There was no answer. Only the sound of carriage wheels, the hiss of rain on the cobbles, and the distant cry of the ragman's mule. At first, it seemed a child's mischief perhaps. She had wandered to the end of the block, to the corner where the candy vendor set up each Thursday. Johann left the shop door ajar and went out calling her name. He walked one street, then another. Neighbors joined, lanterns in hand as dusk fell. They searched the alley behind the brewery, the yards between the tanneries where water pooled in greenish film. By nightfall, the search spread toward the wharves. No one saw her pass, no one heard her cry. When the family returned home, the house felt altered. Elise would later say that the air had gone still, as though even the ticking clock hesitated. Upstairs, Mary's small bed was undisturbed, her doll folded neatly beneath the blanket. In the kitchen, a bowl of milk sat untouched, a thin skin forming on its surface. Johann opened his ledger that night and found his hand would not steady. Where the date should have been recorded, the ink bled into a single word, asterisk missing, asterisk outside. The rain stopped, and with it, the hum of the city. The silence that settled over Callowhill Street was not the peace of night, but the beginning of something that would not lift again. The ledger survived longer than the man who wrote it. Bound in calfskin, its edges darkened with use, it holds the rhythm of a small grocer's life purchases, deliveries, credits, and debts traced in a careful German hand. For years, the script was uniform, the lines measured, the numerals precise. Then, in late March of 1868, the order begins to fracture. The first hint is small, a missed date, an unfinished sum. On the facing page, an ink blot spreads like a bruise, obscuring what might have been a figure or a name. The entry that follows is short, and unlike the rest. Asterisk. No sale this day, Mary missing. Asterisk. The handwriting drags across the paper, its tailstrokes trembling. Archivists who later examined the book remarked on its strangeness. The ink had pooled more heavily than in other entries, suggesting the pen lingered, that the hand behind it hesitated or shook. The indentations cut deeper into the paper fibers, as though pressure alone might fix what words could not. From that point onward, the accounting of the grocery falters. Deliveries go unrecorded. Debts vanish mid-column. Some pages remain entirely blank. On others, Johann's figures appear but without totals, as if he began the work and abandoned it mid-thought. What was once a record of commerce becomes a diary written in omission. The neighbors who entered the shop in the days after the disappearance found the counter unmanned, the scale unbalanced, the bins of grain left uncovered to the dust. A loaf of bread hardened on the shelf. Coins lay scattered near the till. One customer, a seamstress from 2 doors down, would later tell a reporter that the place felt paused, like a mouth open mid-word. Johann himself was rarely seen. When he was, he moved through the aisles without direction, touching objects as if to remind himself they still existed. Each evening, he returned to the ledger. The ink changed tones from deep black to watery gray as though he had thinned it too much in grief. In the margins, he began to write things that were not transactions. Asterisk spoke to constable, no word yet, asterisk and later, asterisk Elise not sleeping. Asterisk by April. His handwriting had grown narrow and erratic, sentences breaking into fragments. Asterisk. Dreamed she was calling from cellar. Asterisk. The last entry for that spring reads, asterisk, merry cold when I wake. Asterisk. It is not dated. When the book was found decades later in the remnants of the Callowhill house, its later pages were warped, as if they had once been wet. No one knows from what water, tears, or rain drawn in through broken windows. The ink had bled into the paper, forming shapes that no archivist could interpret. The official records would later call the Mohrman disappearance unsolved, but the ledger says otherwise. It begins with routine, descends into absence, and ends not in arithmetic, but silence. In those trembling lines, the first true record of the loss survives not in testimony or in police report, but in a grocer's failed attempt to balance his accounts with the dead. The search began at dawn, when the city was still half asleep beneath the fog of coal smoke. Word of the missing child passed from the grocer's door to the butcher's stall, to the lamplighter finishing his rounds. By midday, the story had traveled as far as Race Street. The constable in charge, a man named Decker, recorded the particulars in a small notebook, now brittle with age. Asterisk female, approximately 6, fair hair, last seen outside family shop, Callowhill Street. Asterisk. The ink wavers where the pen was lifted, pressed again, uncertain. Within hours, the search widened. Neighbors drained rain barrels, overturned carts, lifted cellar doors. Wells were checked, one by one, the ropes creaking as buckets descended into the dark. Each time, they rose slick with nothing but water and the reflection of lantern light. The first broadsheet appeared 2 days later, a crude woodcut of a child that resembled no one in particular. The caption beneath offered a reward of $10 for information. The description, copied from the constable's notes, had already begun to bend. Asterisk blue eyes, yellow ribbon, asterisk. Another paper printed the same image but claimed Times green eyes, red ribbon. Scar on chin, asterisk. None agreed on what Mary looked like. Some said her hair was gold, others that it was pale brown. A merchant swore she had been wearing a straw hat, another insisted on a wool cap. It was as if the city itself could not decide which version of her it had lost. Witnesses multiplied, each certain, each contradicting the last. One woman claimed to have seen a man leading the child by the hand near the river docks, another, that she had been alone, chasing a hoop through the alleys. A factory worker swore he heard a cry near the dye works, though he could not say if it was a child or a cat. Reports flooded the constable's office until they blurred into noise. By the week's end, Decker wrote simply, asterisk no credible sighting, asterisk. The city, restless and indifferent, swallowed the story whole. Posters hung on lampposts, curled in the rain. The photograph the family had given one of the few in existence faded beneath the weather, the girl's face dissolving into stains. Nights. The search parties carried lanterns that glowed like weak stars through the fog, their light catching on cobblestones and the damp sheen of cellar steps. They found only scraps, a child's shoe, a broken comb, a ribbon blackened with soot. Each was carried to the Mohrman house, each examined by Elise until she shook her head. By the 10th day, fewer men volunteered. The wells had been emptied, the river dragged, the alleys turned. Silence replaced urgency. Even the newspapers moved on, devoting their columns to strikes and elections. Memory began to warp, reshaping the child in 100 impossible ways. Neighbors, when asked years later, could not agree on the color of her eyes, her height, her voice. The constable's notebook ends with a single line drawn across the page, a final closure where words would not suffice. Asterisk. Nothing found. Asterisk. As if the act of writing it might bury the child more firmly than the earth ever could. Beneath Philadelphia's gridded streets lies another city, one without sunlight or map. In 1868, its breath rose through the seams of the cobblestones, the heat of furnaces, the stink of tallow, the wet exhale of drains that never fully emptied. The war had ended 3 years earlier, but the city had not quieted, it had merely turned inward, industry tunneling beneath the surface. The cellars of warehouses and brewhouses linked to one another by forgotten brick corridors, their arches slick with condensation, rats moved between them like errant messengers. In the slaughterhouses along the Schuylkill, blood seeped into the cracks of the floor and found its way into those same drains. When the tide turned, the river exhaled its scent iron, rot, and salt, carrying it eastward through the alleys of Callowhill Street. It was into this labyrinth of waste and darkness that rumor first descended. Long before the Mohrman girl vanished, there had been whispers of others. Apprentices lost on errands who never returned, factory children missing between shifts. Their disappearances scattered across years and boroughs, unconnected by law, yet drawn together by gossip. Mothers warned their children not to linger near the dye works, where vats of indigo and cochineal boiled day and night, staining the sky with a haze so dense that even at noon the air looked bruised. Workers said the dyes never washed completely away, that the floorboards drank their color, that the stones beneath the vats sweated blue. In those shadows, shapes were said to move after closing, not men, but smaller figures, barefoot, quick, and silent. Police dismissed the talk as superstition, the echo of factory tragedies retold until they lost proportion, but there were details too specific to ignore. Near the old canal locks, scavengers found rags tied into the shapes of dolls, their fabric tinted deep crimson, the stuffing a mix of straw and something finer hair. At the slaughterhouse, a foreman swore that his dogs refused to drink from the runoff ditch, whining as though the water itself whispered. The constable's report from that district lists these notes without conclusion, the handwriting tight and uneasy. Asterisk. Said to be idle talk, asterisk, he wrote, asterisk, but mothers keep their children indoors after dusk. By midsummer, the stories had taken on the shape of fact. They said the dye vats concealed more than color. They said the waste channels led to chambers where the walls pulsed warm even in winter, where the water ran red long after production ceased. When the river receded, bones were sometimes found tangled in the reeds, too small to belong to livestock, too pale to have come from soil. Each discovery passed quickly into rumor, buried by the next day's labor, but the pattern remained. Children missing, water stained, silence thickening beneath the street. It was easier to believe the city's darkness was made by smoke and industry alone, easier to imagine the rot belonged only to beasts, yet those who worked closest to the river knew otherwise. They said that beneath the sound of the hammers and the churn of the vats, you could still hear another rhythm, soft and hollow, like a heartbeat under stone. January came hard that year, the kind of winter that stiffened every hinge and turned the river into a sheet of gray glass. The city lived by the sound of splitting ice, by the hammer blows of men breaking channels for barges that no longer moved. It was near the end of the month, when a false thaw crept in for 3 brief days, that the earth began to loosen its grip on what it had hidden. Behind the old Brant brewery on Callowhill Street, closed since the fire of '63, an ice house sat half-collapsed, its roof caved by snow. Inside, water pooled ankle-deep, trickling into the gutter through a crack in the wall. A boy collecting scrap wood for the stove saw something pale beneath the ice, something that did not move even as the current shifted around it. The constable's report preserves the scene with mechanical precision. Asterisk body of small child discovered approximately 4 feet within the icehouse, face downward, frozen to floor. Condition: advanced pallor, partial decay. Asterisk. It took 3 men with axes to free her, and even then the ice clung to her skin like glass. They wrapped her in a grain sack and carried her to the parish infirmary, the sound of their boots echoing through the empty brewery hall. No one spoke. Those who helped would later tell of the smell, not strong, but sharp, the odor of iron and something faintly sweet, like spoiled fruit. At the infirmary, the clerk hesitated over the register. No name, no age, no certainty. He wrote simply, asterisk female, small, unidentified, asterisk. Yet beside that entry, in the column for location, appears a single word that anchors everything that followed. Asterisk Callowhill. Asterisk. The coincidence was enough to stir old whispers. The Mohrmans had buried no child, filed no notice of death. Their youngest had been missing nearly a year. The neighborhood, eager for closure, convinced itself that the body was hers. Dr. Voss, the city coroner, examined the remains 2 days later. His notes are still kept in the archives, a thin packet of brittle pages bound with string. He wrote that the features were indeterminate, the flesh water-worn. But beneath his list of measurements lies one line circled twice, asterisk bones unusually brittle. Asterisk, he marked no cause of death. Only condition. The report ends abruptly, without signature. When the Mohrmans were summoned, Johann came alone. He stood before the shrouded form and could not speak. The clerk asked for confirmation. He gave none. Instead, he stepped forward, lifted the corner of the linen, and stared in silence until the attendant lowered it again. Then he signed the ledger not with his name, but with a cross. Outside, the thaw ended. The temperature dropped so quickly that the gutters froze solid, trapping the melt where it stood. By morning, the icehouse had sealed again, as if reclaiming what it had given up. The parish buried the child in a pauper's lot, the grave unmarked save for the number etched into the clerk's book. No one knows whether it was Mary or another. Only the address remains certain, and the way the ice cracked open just long enough to speak one name before closing once more. The post-mortem took place in a narrow room behind the parish infirmary, where light fell cold through warped glass. The city's coroner, Dr. Albert Voss, was a man of habit and indifference. His hands, ink-stained as often as bloodied, moved with the precision of someone long acquainted with decay. His ledger survives, written in slanted German script, its entries arranged like equations: height, weight, condition. On the day of the examination, January 29, 1869, the weather was bitter again, the thaw gone. The body lay on a wooden table near the stove, thawed enough to move, the skin pale and translucent. Voss noted the particulars without sentiment times female, approximately 6 years of age, blonde hair, faded, no visible trauma, minor abrasions to the scalp and wrist, teeth intact, bones unusually brittle, asterisk. That last phrase appears not once but 4 times, as if repetition might conjure explanation. The record of the procedure is clinical to the point of cruelty. He measured each limb, each rib, noted the collapse of tissue, the slight distortion of the skull. The organs, when cut, revealed no disease he could name. No water in the lungs, no signs of strangulation, no fractures, no marks of binding. He used the word times, delicate times, where others might have written times small. Asterisk. He paused often, warming his hands over the stove, before taking up the scalpel again. His assistant, a young student from the medical school, later said that the doctor muttered to himself not prayers, but the same phrase repeated softly under his breath. Asterisk, too brittle, too dry. Asterisk. The bones, when touched, crumbled slightly at their ends, as if leached of something essential. Voss examined them beneath lamplight, turning each piece as though searching for pattern. The marrow had thinned to chalk. He wrote this detail with a pen so fine that the ink barely caught. Asterisk possible mineral loss. prolonged exposure, or boiling. Asterisk. The question mark remains in the margin. It is the only punctuation in an otherwise disciplined report. When the examination concluded, Voss cleaned his instruments and ordered the remains prepared for burial. He closed his ledger with a snap and signed only his initials. The assistant asked if the death should be listed as drowning or neglect. Voss, already putting on his coat, said, "Neither. The cause is absence." The phrase puzzled the clerk, who left the column blank. Later that week, the physician's notes were filed among dozens of routine deaths: infants lost to fever, laborers crushed beneath carts, women felled by childbirth. Yet this report stands apart. The handwriting wavers in places, the paper smudged where his fingers pressed too hard. His repetition of the same phrase times bones, unusually brittle times, suggests something he did not wish to name. Years later, when students catalogued his archive, they found no specimens from that case, no preserved samples, no slides. Only the lingering impression of curiosity restrained. The signature at the bottom of the page ends abruptly, the ink trailing off before the final letter, as if even in that moment, Voss preferred uncertainty to what he might have discovered had he written the truth. After the thaw and the quiet burial, the Mohrman house seemed to shrink in on itself. The grocer's window, once lined with jars of sugar and flour, went dim, the curtains drawn so tightly that the sunlight turned gray against them. Customers found the door locked, the bell above it silent. Those who knocked said they heard footsteps on the stairs but no reply. By spring, the shop sign had begun to peel, its letters curling from the wood like dried skin. The neighbors, who had once called the Mohrmans sober but kind, began instead to use words like times withdrawn, asterisk asterisk unnatural, asterisk asterisk struck by God, asterisk. Church records confirm their absence. Their pew sat empty through Lent and Easter, though their tithe was still delivered by hand coins wrapped in paper, placed in the collection box after services ended. Father O'Donnell wrote of it briefly in his parish notes. Asterisk family persists in solitude, woman silent, asterisk. He did not visit, saying later that the house seemed already inhabited by mourning enough. The mother, Elise, was seen rarely after the burial. When she did appear, she walked with her shawl pulled so low it covered half her face. Children in the street stopped their games as she passed. They said she moved like someone listening for a sound that no one else could hear. Inside, according to the maid who stayed only a week, the house was kept immaculate but cold. Dishes scrubbed to gleam, floors washed twice daily, yet a film of dust always settled again by morning. Elise spoke little. Sometimes she was found sitting at the foot of the stairs, her hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on the cellar door. She would sit there until the lamp burned out. Johann worked the shop for a time after, though he sold almost nothing. Customers who ventured in described him as polite but distracted, his sentences trailing off mid-word. In the evenings he left without explanation, walking toward the river with a lantern in hand. The first to notice the dampness of his boots was the milkman. Before dawn, he would find Johann returning from the wharves, his coat hem-soaked, his trousers streaked with silt. When asked, Johann said only that the air by the water was cooler. But the visits became nightly, as steady as the tide. Some said he was searching, that the thaw had not released all the river kept. Others whispered he was visiting the place where the child's body had come ashore. The constable made note of the habit but took no action. Grief, after all, was no crime. By midsummer, even the sound of their voices had vanished from the street. The house became a fixed silence in the midst of the city's noise. No laughter, no prayer, no music from the parlor organ that once played on Sundays. Only the faint smell of vinegar and soap drifting through the shutters, the residue of endless cleaning. A letter from a relative in Camden, preserved in the archive, mentions them once more. Asterisk. The Mohrmans are living, though not quite among the living. The woman speaks to no one. The man walks in circles, as if tracing the shape of something he cannot let go. Asterisk. After that, their name disappears from correspondence, as though even the act of writing it carried contagion. The house on Callowhill remained standing, but its heart had gone elsewhere, perhaps down to the river, where the damp earth never dried, and where Johann's footprints led night after night into the dark. The burial of the child was not a simple matter. The parish records, which document every baptism and death in their careful, slanted hand, begin to stumble over this one. There are gaps where there should be certainties. The line that should have listed the name of the undertaker is crossed out, rewritten twice, then abandoned. The first to refuse was a man named Keener, who operated out of a narrow parlor on Vine Street. His receipt book survives, its pages faded, but legible. The entry for the 2nd of February 1869 reads, Asterisk child, female refused. Condition unfit for presentation. Asterisk no elaboration follows, no invoice, only the notation of refusal. The second undertaker, shot, received the remains 2 days later. His shop stood beside the tallow works, the air thick with the smell of lye and ash. His apprentice later told the coroner that Shot unwrapped the linen only partway before he stopped. He replaced the cloth at once and instructed the boy to return the body to the constable with a brief note. Asterisk, will not proceed. Recommend parish disposal. Asterisk, what precisely disturbed him, no one could say. The rumor spread that the corpse had not decayed as expected, that the skin had taken on a strange stiffness, more like wax than flesh. Others said the body had softened instead, that it wept moisture even in the cold. None of this appears in official record, yet all of it lingers between the lines. The third undertaker, an Irishman named Greeley, agreed to take the case out of pity. He sent his wagon to the infirmary at night, avoiding notice. The driver signed the log, loaded the small coffin, and returned within the hour. Greeley's own ledger carries the entry, the handwriting cramped and uncertain. Asterisk attempted embalming discontinued. Unusual reaction, no further handling. Asterisk. Beneath that, in another ink, perhaps added later. Asterisk burial arranged privately. Without ceremony. Asterisk. The final payment, $3.50, was made by Johann himself, in cash, with no receipt requested. Where the child was finally laid to rest, no one knows. The parish grounds hold no record of a grave under her name, nor under unidentified female. It is possible she was buried in one of the unmarked plots along the river, where the soil was cheaper and the graves unnumbered. Yet a final document complicates the story, a page from the Undertakers' Guild Register, listing transport of remains to private address, Callowhill. Whether this meant the Mohrman home or some other site is uncertain. No inspection followed. Years later, when city inspectors catalogued the abandoned houses in that district, one noted a small mound in the cellar of the Mohrman grocery, the earth sunken in the shape of a shallow cradle. The report does not link it to the child, merely marks it as subsidence, floor unstable. But those who saw it remembered the odor that rose when the ground was disturbed, a faint sweetness, not quite rot, not quite perfume. Whatever was laid there had been placed with care and with secrecy. The silence that followed the burial was total. No headstone, no service, no mention in the parish announcements. Only the receipts remain, each signed by a different hand, each ending in the same phrase, asterisk condition unfit, asterisk. As though even death, in this case, could not be made presentable. The file marked Times Mohrman Inquiry, 1,869 times, was opened by Detective E. L. Kettler in the early spring, when the frost had retreated enough for the streets to smell of iron and sewage again. The folder that remains in the archive is warped, its corners blackened as though by heat. Whether from accident or intent, no one can say. Inside, the surviving pages hold a scatter of statements, interviews with neighbors, merchants, and one exhausted parish official who wished only to close the case. The testimonies do not align. Each contradicts the next, yet taken together they describe a pattern of unease that clung to Callowhill Street long after the child's disappearance. Kettler was a man of numbers, not superstition. He had served with the city police through the riots of '64 and considered himself immune to hysteria. His notes, though brief, betray frustration. He writes of time's nonsensical accounts, inconsistent witness memory, and time's neighborhood predisposed to gossip. Asterisk. Yet, line by line, his language begins to soften. The earliest reports come from the tenants in the adjoining house, two widowed sisters who claimed to hear movement beneath the floor at night, a scraping like furniture dragged slowly across the cellar. They insisted it began weeks before the thaw, when the child's name had already faded from the broadsheets. The sound came, they said, at the same hour every night, just before dawn. A seamstress who worked from the back room of the grocer's house gave another account. She told Kettler that, in the months after Mary vanished, Elise Mohrman had developed a strange habit of carrying parcels wrapped in white muslin down to the cellar after midnight. The woman in white, the seamstress called her, though she admitted that she had never seen Elise's face, clearly only the pale gleam of her gown in the lamplight. When Kettler pressed her for what she thought the parcels contained, she refused to guess, saying only that the bundles were small and handled as though alive. Laborers from the brewery yard described other sounds: faint, singing, rhythmic tapping, the rustle of paper from within the boarded windows. One swore he saw light from beneath the foundation, a steady glow that moved as if following the course of footsteps. Kettler's marginalia beside this entry reads simply, improbable but persistent, he interviewed Johann last. The record of that conversation is incomplete, but what survives is haunting in its restraint. Johann admitted to walking the river at night, but denied visiting the icehouse again. When asked about the cellar, he said it had been sealed since the flooding that ruined his stock. Kettler noted that Johann's hands trembled, the nails darkened by soil. The report ends without conclusion. The detective recommended closure due to lack of corroborating evidence. Yet he signed the final page with a peculiar addendum. Asterisk. To be revisited if further disturbance reported. Asterisk. The handwriting falters there, smudged as though brushed by a wet thumb. Years later, when the archives were catalogued, the Mohrman file was found among records of arson cases, not missing persons. The lower half of the last sheet had burned away, taking with it whatever Kettler wrote next. All that remains legible is one sentence, written in pencil across the top margin, asterisk. There is something beneath that house that does not wish to stay buried, asterisk. The search took place in the damp chill of early March, when the frost still clung to the stone gutters and the air smelled faintly of salt and mold. Detective Kettler returned to the Mohrman property with 2 uniformed officers and a municipal inspector, carrying a signed order to examine the cellar that had been sealed since the winter before. The neighbors watched from their windows as the men pried open the heavy door behind the shop. The hinges gave with a groan like a sigh long held in the dark. A draft rose from below, cold, metallic, and old, carrying with it the odor of brine and rot. The lanterns trembled in their hands. The descent was narrow, the stairs slick with residue. At the bottom, the floor was earthen, soaked unevenly, and the walls glistened with a film that caught the light. There were barrels lined in a row, their lids tarred shut, stamped in black paint with the words times pickled pork, asterisk. The inspector, perhaps eager to dispel suspicion, struck one lid open with the butt of his hammer. The smell that escaped was neither meat nor vinegar, but something heavier, almost sweet, that filled the lungs until breathing felt like swallowing. The contents appeared at first to be scraps of flesh suspended in cloudy brine, but when the lantern was lifted closer, shapes began to emerge too fine, too symmetrical. A small joint, a curved bone, the suggestion of a hand. Kettler's notes from that day are sparse, as though he could not bring himself to describe fully what he saw. He records that samples of organic material were removed for identification, wrapped in muslin, and placed into a wooden case marked for the coroner's office. He also notes that Johann Mohrman was not present, though the sound of footsteps was heard above them, pacing the floor of the closed shop. The other officers refused to remain in the cellar once a second barrel was opened. One of them vomited near the stairs. They replaced the lids and nailed the door shut before leaving. The samples never reached the coroner. Somewhere between the police depot and the parish infirmary, the case vanished. The clerk's log records its transfer, the coroner's receipt does not. When Kettler demanded explanation, each department claimed ignorance. A letter filed weeks later from the city superintendent dismisses the inquiry as clerical loss, possibly misfiled. Yet the evidence list appended to the report contains a note in another hand. Asterisk. Material deemed unfit for retention disposed of. Asterisk. After the search, the Mohrman house was left sealed. The inspector recommended demolition on account of structural instability and foul air, but no action followed. The neighbors swore that the smell returned whenever it rained, rising through the cracks of the pavement, faint but persistent. Those who lived nearby began to whisper that the barrels were not the first of their kind, that the brine had been used not to preserve but to erase. Kettler, disillusioned, closed his file without resolution. His final annotation reads simply, asterisk chain of custody broken, evidence lost. Truth uncertain. Asterisk. But the men who descended into that cellar would later refuse to speak of it at all, each insisting that what they found could not be explained by any ordinary measure of crime or decay. It was as if the darkness beneath the shop had taken back its secret the moment it was exposed, sealing itself again in silence, leaving only the lingering stench of salt to remind the city what it had chosen to forget. The morning the story broke, Philadelphia woke to headlines that seemed too grotesque even for a city hardened by war and factory fires. The Times Philadelphia Inquirer Times ran the first article, its type uneven from haste. Asterisk. The tragedy on Callowhill Street, a family afflicted by fever and misfortune. Asterisk. The reporter, 1J.S. Dorr, claimed to have spoken with neighbors who described the Mohrmans as upright, God, fearing people struck by contagion. The cause, he suggested, was miasma from the nearby tannery, the foul vapors rising through the cellar, poisoning the air, and driving the family into grief and isolation. The tone was sympathetic, almost moralizing, an example of Providence testing the humble. The accompanying illustration showed a respectable shop front, shuttered and unremarkable, beneath which a faint wisp of smoke curled upward, as if to suggest corruption seeping from beneath the earth. The Times Public Ledger Times responded within days, and its account was nothing of the sort. It dismissed disease entirely and replaced pity with horror. The headline read, asterisk, ritual murder on Callowhill child's remains in brine. Asterisk. The article accused the Mohrmans of acts unspeakable. Though couched in euphemism, superstitious rites, domestic deviance, practices foreign to Christian order. The writer, hiding behind initials only, claimed anonymous sources within the police had confirmed that human bones were found prepared and preserved. No mention was made of the lost evidence. Instead, the paper printed a crude diagram of the cellar, labeling the barrels as though they were exhibits in a museum of sin. By the week's end, the story had consumed the city. Broadsheets sold out before noon. Crowds gathered before the shuttered grocery, hurling questions and stones alike. The Mohrman house became a curiosity, a warning, and a stage for rumor. It was said that Elise Mohrman had been seen walking near Street Augustine's, her hands bound in cloth to conceal burns. Others swore that Johann had fled into the river, leaving behind only his hat and an empty boot. None of it could be verified. Then, as abruptly as it had risen, the story collapsed. Both papers printed retractions in language so vague as to be meaningless. The Times Inquirer Times stated only that recent inquiries render prior reports inconclusive. The Times Public Ledger Times withdrew its claims in deference to official silence. No apology followed. No further clarification. The articles disappeared from the next day's editions as though erased. Weeks later, when bound volumes were prepared for the city archives, the issues containing those stories were missing entire pages, the sheets torn or replaced. In their place remained fragments, half-sentences, broken type, a few surviving clippings glued into private scrapbooks by readers who could not let the tale go. One bears a penciled annotation in the margin, written by a librarian decades later. Asterisk. Accounts contradictory. Sources destroyed by fire. Asterisk. The fire itself, according to municipal record, occurred in 1871 and consumed 3 storage rooms of the Times Ledger Asterisk's office. What it did not burn was later pulped for reuse. The result is a silence louder than scandal. No official narrative endures, only the echo of a brief hysteria. 2 papers locked in competition, both consumed by what they tried to name. The Mohrmans faded back into rumor, and the city moved on, leaving behind only confusion, clipped headlines, and the faint impression that something dreadful had indeed happened. Though no one could agree on what it was, the story survived not as history, but as an afterimage blurred, distorted, and impossible to erase. The sale took place quietly, almost furtively, on an overcast afternoon in October. No members of the Mohrman family were present. No one, in fact, could say with certainty where they had gone. The auction notice appeared in the Times Evening Bulletin Times for 1 day only. Small grocery and attached dwelling, Callowhill Street, to be sold for debt. There was no mention of its history, no acknowledgement of the child whose name had once filled the papers. Those who recognized the address kept their distance. The crowd that gathered was thin: 2 merchants, a clerk from the brewery, and a solitary man in a wool coat who did not give his name. The bidding lasted less than 5 minutes. The hammer fell at a price so low that even the auctioneer hesitated before declaring it final. The house changed hands for less than the value of its fixtures. The buyer was later identified as a foreign grocer newly arrived from Hamburg. His signature in the deed book is uneven, as if written by a shaking hand. Beneath it, a note in the margin, perhaps written by the clerk, perhaps by the buyer himself, reads: Asterisk. Odor persists in the floorboards. Asterisk. That single remark is the only surviving testimony to what awaited within. When the new owner took possession, he ordered the shutters opened for the first time in months. Neighbors recalled how the air that escaped from the rooms was so heavy it seemed to thicken the street. The scent was not simply rot, it carried something metallic, faintly sweet, the ghost of brine that had soaked into the boards. Workmen were hired to strip the walls and refit the interior for trade. They began with the front parlor, peeling away damp wallpaper in long, curling sheets. Behind the first layer, they found marks at first thought to be water stains, but soon recognized as deliberate. Small, repeated outlines of a hand, drawn in charcoal directly on the plaster. Each was the size of a child's palm. The impressions multiplied as they scraped further, covering nearly every wall of the lower rooms. Some overlapped, others were faint, almost rubbed away, as though touched repeatedly over time. No names accompanied them, no writing at all, only the relentless repetition of the same shape, traced again and again until the walls themselves seemed to close in. The workers refused to continue after the 3rd day. The grocer dismissed them and hired replacements, but they too abandoned the job, claiming the smell grew stronger the deeper they went. The house never reopened as a shop. The records show that within a year the new owner sold it again at an even lower price, and afterward the property passed from one transient holder to another, each staying only long enough to lose patience or courage. By the 1880 seconds, the address had vanished from directories altogether, absorbed into a row of demolished tenements. Only the deed book preserves its final note, written in a clerk's weary hand. Asterisk. Structure condemned, foundation unstable, interior marked. Asterisk. What was meant by marked, no one explained. But in the archives of the city, among the brittle papers of forgotten sales, That word lingers like a whisper of what was left behind, a warning written in ink where once there had been a child's hand pressed to the wall in silence. The interview took place in the spring of 1901, when the city was already unrecognizable from the one that had buried the Mohrmans in rumor. Electric lights hummed where gas lamps once flickered, and the factories along the Schuylkill belched a thicker, blacker smoke. The woman who came forward was 73, her name recorded only as Mrs. Reiser, a widow living in a charitable home on the outskirts of Germantown. She spoke to a young journalist compiling accounts of forgotten Philadelphia hauntings, though what she offered was not a ghost story. It was memory fractured, uncertain, but edged with conviction. She said she had been 9 years old when the Mohrmans lived next door. Her father, a wheelwright, often sent her to the grocer's shop for sugar or yeast. Mary was younger by 2 years, shy but eager to follow her into the alley behind the house where they played among crates and sawdust. She had a way of humming to herself, the old woman recalled, like she knew a song no one else could remember. On the day the child vanished, she said, the shop was closed, the shutters drawn though the lamps burned inside. She remembered pressing her face to the narrow side window and seeing a light below, not from a lantern, but from a single candle set in the cellar, its flames small and steady against the dark. Her account wavered between confession and apology. She spoke of hearing a lullaby soft, in German, though she could not make out the words. Her mother, who was sweeping the stoop, told her to come away, but curiosity kept her rooted. The song continued until dusk, when the flame guttered out. Later that night, she saw someone she thought the mother carrying a bundle down the steps, wrapped in white cloth. The woman moved slowly, as if cradling rather than carrying. When Mrs. Reiser paused, the journalist prompted her for detail, but she only shook her head. "I was a child," she said. "I didn't understand what it meant." Then came the strangest fragment. She claimed that a week before the disappearance, she had overheard Elise Mohrman speaking to Mary in the alley, scolding her for some unnamed sin. She told her, "We'll make you clean again." Not kind, not soft, like it was something that had to be done, not wanted. When the journalist asked if she thought Elise meant baptism, the old woman's expression changed. "No," she said, "it wasn't a prayer. It was a promise." The transcript ends there. The journalist's editor refused to publish the story, noting in the margin that the woman's recollections were senile and unverified. The recording, if one was made, has been lost. Only the typed copy survives in the Historical Society's archives, misfiled under local superstitions. Yet her words linger with the quiet gravity of something witnessed too young to comprehend. A candle in the cellar, a song that soothed even as it frightened, and a whispered promise to make a child clean again. Whether it was confession or invention, no one can say. But in a city that had long since paved over its past, her memory was like a light burning again in the dark, small, unsteady, and impossible to extinguish. Among the scattered remnants of Dr. Albert Voss's papers, ink-faded pages kept in a municipal archive drawer labeled simply Times Medical 1000, 860 seconds times there survives a single, brittle volume with the spine nearly detached. The pages are filled with neat, angular script, lists of autopsies, case notes, anatomical sketches drawn in pencil smudged by time. Most concern ordinary deaths of the era: consumption, typhoid, industrial accidents. But near the middle, written faintly between two unrelated entries, lies the notation that would later draw the attention of historians: asterisk samples of osseous tissue, female, juvenile, conveyed to University Medical School for further study, AV asterisk. It is dated February 1869, and the margins are lined with faint corrections, as though the entry had been reconsidered. The specimen in question could have been from any child, but the details, date, phrasing, and the initials of the constable listed beside it align precisely with the Mohrman case. What followed remains uncertain. The medical school's inventory from that year makes no mention of a new accession labeled by Voss. In its place, a later curator's record includes a line written decades after: asterisk vacant glass slide missing. Asterisk. That single phrase has become its own form of evidence, the absence recorded more precisely than the object itself. The apprentice who worked under Voss at the time, one Elias Hart, left behind a handful of letters that survived only because they were bound into unrelated correspondence. He was young then, 19, ambitious, and eager to prove himself useful. In one letter to a friend, he describes preparing slides for microscopic analysis of bone altered by strange fragility. The phrasing mirrors Voss's own observation: bones unusually brittle, and suggests that what he handled came from the same child. Hart wrote that the sample crumbled upon contact, as though the structure had been hollowed from within. He added that when placed under the lens, the fragments revealed a shimmer unlike any known decay, a sheen almost metallic. His letter ends abruptly. Dr. V instructed silence, specimen to be retained under lock. When Hart later applied for a post at the city infirmary, his reference letter from Voss contained a curious postscript: asterisk capable, though excitable. Inclined toward imagination. Asterisk. It was the kind of faint praise that buried reputations. Hart never worked in medicine again. His death, 20 years later, was ruled self-inflicted. Among his effects, police listed one microscope of German make, glass plate cracked, interior stained by unknown residue. The university, when questioned in the early 20th century during a cataloging effort, could find no record of any specimen matching the description. The shelf noted in their index as vacant glass slide missing remains empty still. Researchers who have examined Voss's ledger note the faint impression of something once pressed between the pages opposite the entry. A small rectangular outline, perhaps from a slide stored temporarily there before being moved. Whatever it held has long since vanished. But the trace left behind the indentation, the faint smear of glass grit, suggests that, for a brief moment, the evidence passed from hand to hand, from the coroner's table to the young apprentice's microscope, and then into silence. Whether it was carelessness, fear, or deliberate removal that caused its disappearance is unknown. What remains certain is that the missing slide occupies the same liminal space as the child herself, present once, now absent, yet meticulously recorded as if absence itself were part of the record. The entry lies deep within the parish registers of Street Boniface, bound in leather so brittle that the spine flakes away when handled. Most of the pages are filled with predictable solemnities: baptisms, marriages, burials, but between the years 1891 and 1893, the handwriting changes. The script grows less formal, the ink uneven, as though written at night and in haste. It is within that span that the peculiar confession appears. The heading reads simply: asterisk record of the dying private. Asterisk beneath it, the priest has written: asterisk, a woman, name withheld by request. Spoke in delirium of a child who would not stay buried. Asterisk, the date, the 17th of June 1892. The priest's initials F.O., the same Father O'Donnell who had once served the Mohrman parish 2 decades before. According to his account, he was called to a boarding house near the Delaware River to deliver last rites to a widow suffering from fever of the lungs. Her speech was intermittent, feverish, alternating between English and German. Most of what she said was disjointed, but certain phrases stood out enough for O'Donnell to record them phonetically. Asterisk das Kind will nicht ruhen. Asterisk, she repeated, the child will not rest. Asterisk, I buried her, but she came again, cold and bright. Asterisk, he asked who she meant, but she only shook her head. They said the river would take her, she whispered, but the river gave her back. The priest's notes shift here, becoming speculative. He writes, asterisk, could this relate to the Callowhill affair of many years past? Asterisk, he marks the thought Times Confidential. Asterisk, There is no signature from the woman, no witness other than O'Donnell himself. He describes her final moments, eyes open, fixed on a corner of the ceiling, lips forming the word times kind, asterisk, before she exhaled once and was still. Later commentary in the parish log, written by another hand, adds that no next of kin were located, and the burial was arranged through charity. Yet the clerk who recorded the interment drew a faint line between that entry and an older page listing the Mohrman family, long since marked deceased or departed. The coincidence might have meant nothing, but it was enough to keep the story alive within the whispering channels of the clergy. When the confession was rediscovered decades later during archival work, a note had been added in pencil at the bottom margin, asterisk possible reference to Mohrman case. Confidential. Asterisk. No one knows who wrote it or when. The handwriting is different from O'Donnell's, more modern, perhaps a later archivist uneasy with the connection. The confession itself was never made public, though copies circulate among scholars of local folklore who treat it as evidence of an unquiet conscience, perhaps that of Elise Mohrman herself, if she had lived under another name. No formal statement verifies her identity. The widow's death certificate lists her simply as Times female, approximately 60, name unrecorded. Asterisk. The boarding house where she died burned the following winter, taking most of its records with it. Yet that phrase, times a child who would not stay buried, times echoes through the surviving notes like a refrain. Whether it described a haunting, a memory, or a literal truth, it was enough to trouble the priest into secrecy. The confession ends as the city's memory of the case did, half spoken, half erased, the words fading even as they were written, but the meaning persisting, stubborn as the smell of brine that once clung to the house on Callowhill Street. The plate was found by accident in 1936 during the reorganization of the city archives, a plain glass negative wrapped in crumbling brown paper misfiled among property surveys. It bore no label at first, only a faint pencil mark along the edge. Asterisk Callowhill. Asterisk. When light struck its surface, the image appeared slowly, as if surfacing from water. A parlor frozen in ghostly clarity, each detail suspended in silver. The furniture was modest upright chairs, a lace-covered table, a clock stopped at 11. The walls, stripped of decoration, carried faint traces of where frames once hung. It was the kind of photograph common to the 1,860 seconds, the staged portrait of a family meant for posterity. Yet here, posterity had soured. When enlarged, 3 figures emerged: the father standing stiff beside the chair, the mother seated with her hands folded in her lap, and a boy, no older than 10, positioned dutifully between them. The 4th presence is not seen directly, but only implied. In the mirrored surface of a framed print behind the family, the faint reflection reveals another face, small and indistinct, caught between light and shadow. It appears at the edge of the frame, where the mirror's silvering fades. 3 faces sit for the camera, but the reflection shows 4. The archives labeled it Times Mohrman family, circa 1868, asterisk after comparison with census records and the surviving parish photograph of Johann taken for his business license. But the origin of the image is uncertain. Some say it was taken by a traveling photographer whose work included memorial portraits, the kind meant to preserve the likeness of the dead alongside the living. Others claim it was produced later, after the child's disappearance, by a neighbor seeking proof that grief leaves marks not even the lens can deny. In the 1,940 seconds, the plate drew brief attention from researchers studying early photographic anomalies. They debated the phenomenon with the measured tone of science. Some argued double exposure, others the imperfection of collodion, a trick of light caught by long exposure and uneven development. Yet none could explain why the 4th face aligns perfectly with the angle of the mother's gaze, as though she were looking not at the camera, but at something just beyond its sight. In 1961, a restorer attempted to clean the plate. Under magnification, he noted that the image's emulsion had degraded unevenly. The section containing the 3 family members remained clear, while the mirrored corner showed minute scratches, as if something pressed repeatedly against the glass from within. He documented the finding and stored the plate in a padded sleeve marked Times Handle with Care. Asterisk. When the archives were digitized a century later, the scan captured the same eerie geometry, 3 living figures, one faint specter, frozen between presence and absence. To the rational mind, it is nothing more than an optical illusion, a coincidence of reflection. Yet to those who know the story of the Mohrmans, it feels like proof of persistence. The image suggests that what was taken from the world did not wholly depart, that the camera, indifferent to belief, recorded what memory alone could not. The child's absence transformed into presence by light. In the glass there remain 4 souls, arranged as though for eternity. A family, reunited only in reflection, their gaze fixed forever on something that was never meant to be seen. The widening of Callowhill Street in 1910 began as a matter of progress, a project meant to ease the choking traffic of delivery carts and electric trolleys. By summer, demolition crews had already razed half the old block, tearing up what remained of the Mohrman property. By then, nothing more than a sagging frame swallowed by ivy and soot. The workers treated it like any other condemned structure, until the foreman's spade struck something that rang not like stone, but like wood hardened by time. They cleared away the debris and revealed a narrow box wedged beneath what had once been the shop floor, its boards blackened and warped. The men thought at first it was an animal's grave, the kind of improvised burial that lingered in city lots. But when the lid was pried open, a breath of air escaped, dry and sour, followed by the faint scent of salt. Inside lay fragments cloth decayed to lace, dust thick as ash, and 2 small bones curved like parentheses, unmistakable in their symmetry. A jawbone, split at the hinge, and beside it a second, smaller still, as if belonging to the same skull. Nothing else remained, no nameplate, no coffin lining, only the impression of something that had once been whole. The city police were called, though by then curiosity had already spread. By dusk, a small crowd had gathered along the excavation site, whispering that the ground had finally yielded what it had kept for 40 years. The report filed that night by Inspector Randall lists the find as child's remains, incomplete 2 mandibular bones, deteriorated textile remnants. The note beneath, written in another hand, adds, asterisk, located at site of former Mohrman property, subject of inquiry 1869. Asterisk. The bones were transferred to the parish, where identification might have followed if anyone had claimed them, but the church balked. The new pastor, Father Hanlon, refused reburial until the remains could be verified as Christian dead. His letter to the coroner reads, asterisk, no baptismal record matches. We will not consecrate soil for uncertainty. Asterisk. The coroner, unwilling to reopen an ancient case, placed the fragments in a small box marked Times Unclaimed Evidence. Asterisk. Months passed. The construction continued. The parish, pressed by reporters, offered no statement. The bones were never catalogued beyond the temporary note in the register. When auditors visited the coroner's office in 1913, the box was gone. The clerk responsible for inventory insisted he had never seen it. In its place on the shelf was an empty tag bearing only a single word, asterisk returned, asterisk. Returned to whom, no one knew. The parish denied receipt, the city denied involvement, and the foreman, when questioned years later, said the night after the discovery he had dreamt of a girl standing at the edge of the trench, her face indistinct, her mouth moving though no sound came. When he woke, he found the odor of brine still clinging to his hands. The official files closed there, a few yellowed pages bound with rusted staples. The street was finished that autumn, paved clean and smooth over whatever hollow still lay beneath. Automobiles soon passed daily over the spot where the coffin had been found, their tires hissing softly as if over water. To the city, it was progress. To those who remembered, it was something else, a reminder that the ground, like the past, never truly forgets what was buried in its dark. By the 1920 the Mohrman name had vanished from every record except those yellowed pages buried deep in the city archive. The house itself was long gone, replaced by a row of brick warehouses and a crooked lamppost that flickered even on windless nights. Yet in the narrow streets behind Callowhill, the story endured, passed from mouth to mouth among the children who played there after dusk. They called her times Mary of the Basement Asterisk, and though none of them knew where the name came from, they all knew what it meant. The tale was always told in whispers, never shouted. She was said to live beneath the ground, in the old cellars that still honeycombed the district, those sealed chambers left over from the city's first century, where the foundations of demolished houses lingered like fossils. If you walked too late past the loading docks, they said, you might hear her knock from under the floorboards, a soft tapping that came in threes. Not loud enough to frighten, only enough to make you stop. Those who knocked back, always children, never adults, sometimes heard a reply. And if they stayed still, they might catch the sound of a girl's voice humming from below, a tune with no words, slow and even, the kind one might use to lull something to sleep. Parents dismissed it as street superstition, the sort of myth that grows in neighborhoods where history has been buried but never explained. Yet what unsettled the older residents was how precisely the story matched details that had never appeared in any newspaper. The mention of the song German in rhythm, if not in language, the number of knocks. The idea of something small and restless beneath the floor. Only those who had read the sealed parish records, or heard whispers from retired constables, could have known those things. Still, the children insisted they had heard it themselves. A report from 1,932 inches, a local folklore survey, mentions the legend briefly. Asterisk. The children of Callowhill Street refuse to step on certain grates after dark, claiming they lead to the place where the little one knocks. Asterisk. The researcher, dismissive, attributed it to industrial noises from the new trolley line. But one entry in his notes never published records that he heard the sound himself during an interview. He described it as faint percussion from below ground, regular but without mechanical pattern. He marked the location, the pavement over what had once been the Mohrman lot. Over time, the story changed its shape but not its root. By mid-century, Mary of the Basement had become a warning tale told to keep children from wandering too close to construction sites or river drains. In some versions, she was a protector, in others, a ghost that traded names with those who listened too long. But always she came from below, and always she carried that same soft rhythm of knocking, patient and precise. The adults laughed at it, but even laughter was a way of remembering. In a city where official memory failed, where records burned, files vanished, and witnesses died, the story became its own archive. Truth, after all, needs no permission to survive. It hides in rumor, in games, in the songs of children who never learned the names behind their fear. And so, long after the cellar was filled and the river changed its course, the knocking still found its way through the cracks. Each generation heard it differently, but all agreed on one thing. The sound came from beneath, gentle at first, then closer, as if the past itself was asking to be let in. In the basement of the Philadelphia City Records office, where the air hums faintly with the vibration of pipes and the smell of damp paper never quite fades, the shelves of case files line the walls like sediment, layer upon layer of the city's forgotten crimes. The fire of 1873 had been well documented, a blaze that consumed several thousand pages of court and police proceedings when a kerosene lamp overturned during an overnight watch. The official account listed the casualties in neat bureaucratic order: birth certificates, property deeds, minor thefts, and assorted homicide files, destroyed beyond retrieval. For most, that explanation was enough. But among archivists, one particular absence drew quiet attention. Case No. 741 times Mary Mohrman, possible homicide, times marked as destroyed by fire, though the record of its destruction did not exist within the ledger of losses. A century later, when the archives were reorganized, a researcher noted something stranger still. The sequential numbering of cases leapt cleanly from 740 to 742. No placeholder, no notation, no ghost entry. The index card for 741 had been typed later, in a different hand, using a ribbon of darker ink. Someone, at some point, had written the case into existence retroactively, an act of remembering after official memory had already been erased. The archivist's margin note reads, asterisk discrepancy unresolved. Possibly removed prior to fire. Asterisk. Yet fragments remain in peripheral records, memos, receipts, and correspondence that orbit the missing file like faint satellites. A requisition slip from February 1869 bears the name of Detective E.L.L. Kettler and references investigative photographs, Callowhill premises. Another sheet lists an evidence transfer to the coroner's office, countersigned by an assistant who did not begin his employment until 2 months after the date of the fire. Each piece of paper gestures toward the file's existence, but none confirm it. In legal terms, it is a phantom neither proven lost nor proven real. Archivists who've handled the surviving materials describe subtle inconsistencies, as though the absence were actively maintained. The handwriting on the surrounding entries appears faintly altered, slanted where before it was upright, as if recopied by a different clerk. One folder bears a watermark not manufactured until years later. Even the numbering on the metal drawers skips in its sequence. The small brass tag that should read 741 is simply blank. To most, these are trivial errors, the natural entropy of record keeping. But for those who have studied the Mohrman case, the void feels deliberate. Files are lost all the time, but few leave a space so cleanly excised, as if the paper had burned before the fire ever touched it. The city's official catalog acknowledges the destruction, but refuses to list the document's subject matter. No victim, no location, no investigator, only the number and the note. Asterisk, destroyed by fire. Asterisk. In archival practice, every absence acquires its own mythology. Staff whisper that the file still exists, sealed in a private collection or hidden in the university vaults. Others insist it was destroyed not by accident but by instruction that its removal was an act of mercy or of containment. When the lights flicker in the record room, the rumor says, the drawers tremble as if breathing, as though the past, denied its paper and ink, still presses against the steel from within. Whatever truth remains, it lives between those two numbers 740 and 742, a silence preserved by bureaucracy. A case that should have existed, yet officially never did. The city, with its endless ledgers and carbon copies, had found a way to bury not just a child, but the memory of its own knowing. The modern archivist works in a room without windows, where the hum of fluorescent lights replaces the sound of wind. Around them are the remnants of a case that never settled into truth. The brittle pages of ledgers, police receipts smudged with ink, the charred edges of a folder that may or may not have once held a child's name. The air is dry, heavy, with the smell of paper that has forgotten its purpose. They sit among it all the incomplete records, the contradictions that form their own coherence, and try to arrange what remains into a story that will stay still long enough to be believed. Each document carries its own kind of resistance. A ledger that trembles at the edges, too fragile to touch, a newspaper clipping retracted before it was read. A coroner's note that records condition without cause, observation without faith. The archivist reads them aloud, as if repetition might force the dead into speech. The phrases are sparse, measured, but the weight of what they refuse to say grows heavier with each page. The bones that vanished in transit, the missing slide from the medical school, the unfiled confession of a woman who may have been the mother herself. The archivist writes the words again on a clean sheet, each one echoing through the centuries. Asterisk missing, unfit, destroyed, unclaimed, asterisk. The vocabulary of erasure. In the logic of record keeping, absence is neat. It is something that can be filed. But here the absences multiply until they fill the frame entirely. A file destroyed by fire that left no ashes. A house sold for less than the price of its locks. A child whose death was never proven, whose body was found, buried, and found again. The archivist begins to understand that what remains is not evidence, but the echo of bureaucracy attempting to bury its own unease. The handwriting shifts across the centuries, but the tone remains constant, distant, procedural, unwilling to touch what it describes. In one of the earliest ledgers, the archivist finds the father's note, still legible despite the decades. Asterisk, no sale this day, Mary missing. Asterisk, the same phrase reappears in the closing inventory, written in a different hand, as though the city itself had chosen to mimic his grief. The line circles back upon itself, a perfect loop of loss. Record as elegy, paper as grave. When the archivist closes the final folder, the sound is soft, almost merciful. The story ends where it began, not in revelation, but in quiet refusal. The air in the archive seems to still. Nothing moves but the dust, rising briefly before settling again, as if the room itself exhales. In that silence, the distance between document and ghost disappears. The ledger, the rumor, the photograph, the voice, they converge into a single truth too thin to name, that what is missing does not vanish, it waits. And in the waiting, the story devours itself, leaving behind only the shape of what once tried, and failed, to be remembered.